Hi, I'm Rick Arnold, and I'm going to show you a really easy way to cut and install a hip roof. Hip roof only consists of 3 components for the most part: the hip rafter, jack rafters, and the king rafter, which is actually a common rafter from the rest of the roof. I'm going to take you through 4 easy steps: calculating the rafters, marking the rafters, cutting the rafters, and installing the rafters. Very, very simple. So let's have some fun. Okay, so we're going to start with common rafters. There's 4 simple steps to cutting and installing the rafters. First step is calculating the rafter lengths using a construction master or even a regular calculator. The second step is transferring those calculations to our rafter stock. Once they're transferred to the rafter stock, we cut the rafters. Once the rafters are cut, we take them and install them up on the roof. 4 simple steps no matter what type of rafter you're cutting. So let's start with the common rafter. So to calculate the common rafter, we only need to know 2 things. One is the run of the rafter, the other is the pitch of the rafter. The run of the rafter is the distance of the building that is covered by the rafter itself. So this rafter comes up, right up to the peak, drop a perpendicular line down from here over. That measurement is our run. We have to adjust the run a little bit because our rafters do not come up and meet in the middle like that. If they did, then exactly half of the building would be the run. But because we put a ridge in between the rafters at the top, our rafter stops exactly 3/4 of an inch back on both sides because we're using a 2x ridge here. So we draw a plumb line down from that rafter, and from that point over, that is our run. So in other words, if I'm measuring over, our building is 8 feet and 1 inch. If I measure over here to 4 feet 1/2 inch, that's our exact center. But because we have a ridge here, we have to subtract 3/4 of an inch back. So 4 feet 1/2 inch minus 3/4 of an inch, this plumb line comes down, that gives us 47 3/4 of an inch. That's our run. All we're doing is forming a triangle with our roof rafter and our building. So our adjusted run is 47 3/4 of an inch from the end of the building to this edge right here. That's the bottom of our triangle. So I'm going to write it right on here, 47 3/4 of an inch. That's our run. Now the second thing we need to determine is the pitch of the roof. For every foot of run of a roof rafter, the pitch is the distance that it goes up. In this particular instance, we're going to do a 6-inch pitch roof. So that means 12-inch run, we have the roof going up 6 inches. I know what some of you are thinking right now. This isn't the pitch, this is a rise, because we're going up, so that's a rise. And the pitch is some degree measurement here. But the common language in calculating our rafters, this is the pitch. This is a pitch in an inch measurement, 6-inch pitch. It's on the calculator, that's how we enter it. So what we have is the run, which is 47 3/4 of an inch, and the pitch is 6 inches. Those are the only 2 things we need to calculate everything. We have the run, we have the pitch. So I get the calculator out, and I'm going to enter 47 3/4, and that's my run. Comes right from here. And then I'm going to enter 6 inch, and push the pitch button. Now I can calculate all of the rafters. To get the rafter length, which is a diagonal measurement, we push the diagonal button, and our common rafter length is 53 3/8 of an inch. So let's write that here. Common is 53 3/8. We're doing a hip roof, and the hip and the valley are same calculation. So whether you're doing a hip or a valley, same thing. We're doing a hip. All I have to do to find the length of the hip rafter is push the hip valley button. 71 5/8 is the length of our hip rafter. So the hip is 71 5/8. That's the length. Now the jacks are the intermittent small rafters that come off the hips. To find those, we just push the jack button. We have to push it a few times because it runs us through the on-center spacing, giving us options whether to increase it or decrease it. But it's set at 16 inches on center, and I push the jack button. Jack number 1 is 35 1/2. So we're going to write that here. Jack 35 1/2. Push the jack button again. Jack number 2 is 17 5/8. Push it again, and jack number 3 is 0 because we've gotten to the end of the hip roof and there are no more jacks. Now to transfer our calculations, our rafter length, onto the rafter, I'm using a framing square. There are a number of different ways to transfer it on there, but this is the best way that I found. This is the most accurate, and we want the first rafter to be the most accurate because, again, we're cutting all the other rafters off this one rafter. So to set the framing square, we need to set it at a 6-inch pitch. And to do that, I'm using a straight edge and a couple of spring clamps, and I'm going 12 inches over. That's where the straight edge meets the 12-inch mark right here. And I'm being very careful with this. I'm really dialing it in. And over here, I'm going 6 inches up. That's our pitch, 12 inches over, 6 inches up. I'm going to mark this top cut. So that's the plumb cut of the rafter. Now, rather than measuring the length of the rafter from this line, I'm first going to cut this. Then I can hook the tape onto the long point, measure the rafter, and I know it's going to be right on the money. So now we're ready to mark the common rafter. Calculations, the common rafter length is 53 3/8. So now that I've cut the plumb cut, I'm hooking the tape on the long point, measuring down 53 3/8 of an inch. Right there. Keeping that oriented in the same direction, I'm going to slide this down until we hit 53 3/8 of an inch. And here's our rafter, end of the building to the ridge. But this isn't going to work. I did this to illustrate a point. What we need to do is mark the rafter properly so we have a tail. We need the tail to have all the components of the roof. We have to make a seat cut and a heel cut, which will enable the top of the rafter to come up off the plate. And this is what's known as the height above plate. No matter how high above plate you raise the rafter length remains the same. All we're going to do is add a tail to it. The rafter length is 53 3/8 of an inch. I put the rafter square back up in the proper orientation, slide it down, and draw a plumb line. This represents the outside of the building. It's also the start of our bird's mouth cut. This part is called the heel cut. To determine the seat cut, I'm going to use the width of the top plate plus the 1/2 inch sheathing. The top plate is 3.5 inches, the sheathing is 1/2 inch, so my seat cut is going to be 4 inches from that plumb line. So there's my seat cut, here's my heel cut, there's the bird's mouth, I simply notch that out. But before I do that, I want to determine the edge of my overhang. For this, I'm going to slide the square back up along the plumb line, along the inside, and for this roof, I'm going to have a 8-inch overhang. So for an 8-inch overhang, I'm going to use an 1.5 inch subfascia, which comes to 6.5 inches. So I'm going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.5. There's the outside edge of my tail cut. And that's the outside edge of the rafter. The bottom of the subfascia is 5 1/4 inches down from the top of the rafter. So I'm going to go 5 1/4 inches, make a mark, slide the square back up, mark it horizontally. Now there's our soffit cut, also known as a planter cut. Okay, here's my pattern. Fits on, top is flush, it fits perfectly. Now that we're done with the common roof, let's move on to the hip roof. Now that the common rafter is cut, we have to know the exact measurement of the height above plate. To do that, I put the square on the outside edge against the heel cut, draw straight up, and then measure that distance. And this is exactly 4 1/4 inches. So our height above plate is 4 1/4 inches. This is a critical measurement. We're going to need it when we lay out the hip rafter. But how do we know where the common roof stops and the hip roof starts? Very, very easy. All we need to know is the run of the common rafter. In this case, our run was 47 3/4 of an inch. So all we do is measure from the front of the building, 47 3/4 of an inch. That's where the common roof stops and the hip roof starts. The first part of the hip roof system is actually a common rafter from the same roof. Now this is no longer a common rafter, it's called the king rafter. All that's left are the remaining rafters, the hips and the jacks. This is the stock for our hip rafter. You'll notice it's larger than the common rafters. Typically a hip rafter is one size larger than the common rafters. Here we use 2x6 common rafters, so the hip rafter is going to be a 2x8. But before I mark it out, I have to do one major important thing, and that's adjust the square to mark the hip rafter. To do that, I'm simply going to move my stick from 12 inches to 17 inches. And it's going to take a while because I go from one end and that adjust it a little bit back up here. This stays at 6. It's still a 6-inch pitch. But because it's a hip rafter, we're moving the gauge to 17 inches. This is the only time we change the run on the rafter square. Now I know some of you out there are asking, why 17 inches? I'll tell you why. Because I said so. I'm going to mark the top of the hip 1.5 inches wide, because at the top of the hip rafter, I need a point in the center, which means a double bevel cut or a double cheek cut. So when I cut this with the saw, I'm setting it at a 45-degree angle. I'm going to go along this side and then go along this side, and that'll give me a nice point at the top of the hip rafter, which fits into the intersection of the common roof. So I'm setting the saw at 45 degrees. And how do I know which line to cut first? Well, after I cut the first one and I look for the second line and it's on the ground with the cutoff, I know I have to start over again. So there's a double 45 bevel, or a double cheek cut. Now that the top bevel is cut, I can hook my tape measure on the long point and mark the length of the rafter, which is 71 5/8. Then I take the framing square, which again was adjusted to 17/6, slide it down, draw a plumb line. Now this is where we have to vary a little bit from the common rafter. With the common rafter, we determine the seat cut of the bird's mouth by the top plate, which was 4 inches. If I did that here, the height above plate would be much taller than the height above plate for the common rafter. So what I have to do is measure from the top of the rafter down, the height above plate of the common rafter, which is 4¼ inches. Raise this up, and now that is the seat cut for the hip rafter. It's going to be much longer, but that's the way it works because we have a larger dimension board here. The important thing is to make sure that the height above plate is 4¼ inches down from the top so that it matches the common rafter. So here's my seat cut, but I have to adjust the seat cut for what's called a hip drop. If I don't do that, the top of the rafter won't plane out with the rest of the roof. Now here's a trick to find out the hip drop very easily rather than pulling the calculator out. It's based off the thickness of the hip rafter. Here I have 1.5 inches hip rafter. Half of that is 3/4, so I'm always using half the thickness of the hip rafter. And all I do is hold this along the seat cut, and then along the plumb cut, I'm going to move the square up 3/4 inch off the plumb line, and then draw a new seat cut. There's my new cut line, and that's the thickness of the hip drop. Now I know there are a few of you out there that are wondering, how does this guy know that the hip drop is based on half the thickness of the rafter? Because I said so. The last thing we have to lay out is the tail. It's a little different than the common, a little bit more complicated to lay out. We have to go back to the calculator. Just like the common rafters, the only thing we need to know, the only two things, is the run and the pitch. We already know what the pitch is. It's a 6-inch pitch. But what's the run? The run is based off the length of the projection of the common rafter. If you remember, our common rafter tail was projected out 6½ inches away from the building. That's our run. First I enter 6½ inch run. Then I enter our 6-inch pitch. And because it's the hip rafter, I push hip valley raft button, and the length of our tail there is 9 3/4 of an inch. Measure down 9 3/4. Slide the square down. In order to mark the soffit cut, I first need to extend the plate line out past the bird's mouth. Now I need to determine how far down the soffit cut is from the plate. It's kind of like the height above plate, only in reverse. This is the measurement that I need to determine. Here's my soffit, carrying it straight over. And I'm measuring the distance from the soffit to the plate. And in this case, it's exactly 4 inches. So here's the plate line. I want to go 4 inches below the plate line. So I slide the square down along the plate line until it reaches 4 inches. That 4 inches is my soffit cut. Now I cut the bird's mouth, I cut the soffit cut, I cut the tail cut, and I'm all set. Here's a little trick to make it easier to cut the double bevel cut or the double cheek cut on the tail of the rafter. Slide this down, and I'll bet you didn't know what this little hole was here for on the tongue of the framing square. Since this is 1.5 inches thick, I'm putting the cut line right in the center of that hole. And then I simply mark both sides all the way down. And these are my 2 cut lines. Just like the top, I'm going to cut a 45-degree angle going this way, reverse the saw, cut a 45-degree angle that way, and I have the opposite point down at the tail of the rafter, right where I need it. Degree bevel. I know what you're waiting for, and it's not going to happen. Perfect fit. Now let's go cut the jack rafters. Before I mark out the jack rafter, I have to readjust the framing square. Remember I said the only time we changed the framing square from 12 to 17 inches was on the hip rafter? Well, we're marking the jack rafters, which are really common rafters that are interrupted by the hip coming down. So I have to put this back to a common rafter measurement, which is 12 inches over and 6 inches up. You might have to go back and forth a couple of times to dial it in and make sure, again, it's very precise, right on the marks. Run my tape at the top long point, measure down the length of my first jack rafter, which is 35.5. But I'm going to extend that just 7/16 of an inch, simply because I want my jack rafters to fall exactly 16 inches on center from my last common rafter. So all I do is add 7/16 of an inch onto that measurement on all of the jack rafters. Then I'll draw the plumb line. Why is it 7/16 of an inch? Because I told you so. Now the last part of marking this out is very simple. What I did was cut the tail off a common rafter. I simply use this to trace out the tail of the jack rafter. I'll line it up to the plumb cut, Then I trace the tail, and then the seat cut. I use the same piece to mark out the next jack rafter, which is a little bit shorter. Here's the plumb cut. The measurement is 17 5/8 of an inch, plus, again, the 7/16 of an inch extra to make sure it lands 16 on center with the last common rafter. Here's the heel cut. Line up the pattern. Mark the seat cut, the tail, and the soffit cut. Now I'm ready to cut the jack rafters. I'm going to adjust the saw at a 45-degree bevel for the plumb cut of the jack rafter because it seats right up against the diagonal hip rafter. The jacks on the opposite side of the hip rafter are mirror images of this, so we have to make sure those jacks have the opposite bevel cut. To do that is very simple. Neat little trick. I'm going to use these jacks to trace out the next jacks, and as long as I put the long point onto the stock and cut with the stock facing up, I'll get the exact mirror image. Whenever I'm tracing these, any rafters, and using one as a template or a pattern, the key thing is to make sure the top is perfectly flush. I don't care if the bottom is flush at all, but the top of the roof has to be flush. After all, I'm a framer. I want the top to be flush. Who cares about the finished guy that has to deal with the underside of the roof? Now we have mirror image jack rafters. I'm marking the jack rafters 16 inches on center off the face of the king rafter. When I mark the other side, I'm going to mark them 16 inches on center off the face of the last common rafter. The reason I can mark right off the king rafter and the last common rafter is because I added that 7/16 of an inch onto the jack rafter measurement. If I didn't, I wouldn't be able to lay them precisely where they belong. And there you have it. But several times during this video, I told you to do something because I said so. But if you're going to make this part of your profession, you really need to understand all the details and all the elements of a roof. But that's another video. So I know somebody's out there saying, how do I know this is really going to work? Because I said so. Trust me, it works. Now I know somebody out there is saying, how does he know that the hip drop is based on half the thickness of the rafter? Because I said so. But trust me, I've done this many times and it works. All right. You rolling?
Yeah.
Okay. Now I know some of you out there are questioning, how does this guy know that the hip drop is based on half the thickness of the rafter? Trust me, I've done this before, and because I said so. I know there's somebody out there that's saying, how did this guy know that the hip drop is based on half the thickness of the rafter? Because I said so.